In a high-stakes Senate hearing watched by over 12 million Americans, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stands face-to-face with Senator Cory Booker, who launches a blistering attack, accusing her of corruption and partisanship. But with unwavering poise, Jasmine remains calm, allowing Booker's accusations to build, until, with surgical precision, she strikes back. In one devastating moment, she exposes Booker's own dubious donations and political maneuvering, shattering his moral high ground. Will this be the end of Booker's career, or has Jasmine just rewritten the rules of political power forever? Under the stark lighting of the Capitol hearing room, the air was thick with tension. It was early, yet every seat was filled, every lens aimed. Reporters murmured. Staffers traded glances. This wasn't just a hearing, it was a staged confrontation. In the center sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, still as stone, her leather folder resting quietly in front of her. No fidgeting, no nerves. Just controlled breath and sharp eyes that scanned the room without a flicker of fear. Across from her, Senator Cory Booker leaned forward, confident, rehearsed, ready to strike. To him, Crockett wasn't just a witness. She was a political opponent to be dismantled. Live. Booker radiated certainty, bolstered by party allies and press buzz. Crockett, by contrast, had no safety net. Just her voice, her facts, and that unreadable folder. But there was something off about how calm she looked, like she wasn't surprised to be under attack. Like she'd read this script before. The power imbalance was clear. He had the spotlight, she had the crosshairs. And yet it was her silence that unsettled the room. The question lingered in the air, unspoken but sharp. Had Jasmine Crockett walked into a trap, or come prepared to spring one? Emotions tightened like a noose as the silence broke. Not with Jasmine's voice, but with the calculated precision of a man who had rehearsed his strike. Senator Cory Booker leaned into the microphone before Jasmine could complete her introduction. His tone was silk over steel, measured, polished, but unmistakably loaded. "Mr. Chairman," he began, pausing just long enough for the room to quiet. "Before we proceed, I believe it's necessary to acknowledge a concern regarding the objectivity of our witness." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. In just a few words, he threw shade across the table, casting Jasmine not as an expert, but as a partisan operative in disguise. Ms. Crockett has a well-documented history of political activism, including appearances at rallies and commentary that aligns closely with one side of the aisle. That raises serious questions about the neutrality of the data she's here to present. He smiled faintly, turning toward the cameras, not her, as if the real audience wasn't in the room but at home, watching the clip he'd just manufactured for them. It was a subtle assassination of credibility, not meant to draw blood in the room, but to seed doubt across 1,000 screens. There was no objection, no gavel, just the shifting of weight across leather chairs and the low hum of approval from his allies. A few Democratic aides exchanged knowing looks, their expressions smug, already half composing the tweet. Booker holds Crockett accountable? One even nudged another, eyes on the live viewfinder, nodding with satisfaction as the camera zoomed in on Jasmine's unreadable face. Across the aisle, Republican senators frowned, their arms crossed, the tension in their brows saying what decorum wouldn't let them speak aloud. They recognized the tactic, a surgical political ambush cloaked in procedural language. Jasmine had said nothing controversial. She had not raised her voice. Yet already she'd been branded. Her integrity, impugned before her evidence, even left the folder resting at her fingertips. It wasn't just disrespect. It was design. Booker had planned this interruption not to extract truth, but to provoke reaction. Not to debate ideas, but to bait a misstep. Because a sharp retort, a flustered look, even a slight hesitation would be enough to confirm the narrative he was constructing. Unhinged, biased, unreliable. And he knew, better than most, that in politics, optics can bury substance. This wasn't cross-examination. It was character demolition dressed up in Senate decorum. And the most damning part? It worked precisely because it wasn't overt. There was no slur, no shouted insult, just the quiet, elegant implication that Jasmine didn't belong here. Not because of her data, but because of who she was, where she had stood, and what she had once said. Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't look down, didn't break eye contact, didn't shift in her seat. But inside that stillness was the crushing weight of a truth too old to name out loud, that she would always be judged by a different scale, that a man like Booker, once praised for his own activism, could now use hers as ammunition, and no one in power would call it what it was. Not unfair, not discriminatory, just politics. But Jasmine knew better. What she faced wasn't scrutiny, it was choreography. A performance engineered to strip her credibility without ever raising a voice. And at that moment, the question stopped being whether she would recover from this ambush. It became something deeper, something darker. How many times had she faced this same trial, behind different microphones, under different lights? And how many more were still to come? She hadn't said a word in her own defense, but the hearing already felt like a trial. And now Senator Booker was about to push things even further. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His words came slowly, calmly, almost like he was regretting having to say them, though he clearly didn't. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "I think we need to be honest about something. Some of the organizations connected to Congresswoman Crockett's research have been involved in efforts to challenge the results of certified elections." He didn't accuse her directly. He didn't say she led those efforts. But the meaning was clear. She was tied to people who tried to undo elections. That idea hung in the air like smoke. "I'm not saying she acted in bad faith," Booker added, "but for the sake of this committee's credibility, we should question whether her testimony is truly unbiased." With that, he leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He had done what he came to do, put doubt in the air without having to prove anything. The room didn't explode, it tightened. Quietly, a few staffers stopped taking notes. One aide whispered to another with a look that said, "This just got serious." No one called out what Booker had done, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a debate about research anymore. He had tied Jasmine to something dangerous, something that questioned her loyalty to the democratic process itself. He didn't need proof. Just the hint of it was enough, and nobody stopped him. No one asked for sources. No one said, "That's too far." Because in politics, it's not always about truth. It's about perception. And now the perception was this: Jasmine Crockett might be part of something untrustworthy. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't frown or blink. Her hands stayed folded on the closed folder in front of her. But behind that stillness was something powerful. This was not the first time she had faced this kind of treatment, where her work, her background, her very presence were treated like a threat. Booker didn't attack her directly. He didn't have to. By connecting her name to controversy, he made the public question everything else she might say. It was quiet, polite, and devastating. And what made it worse? The silence that followed. Not from her. That silence was strength. But from the others. No one stood up for her. No one pushed back. No one even asked Booker to explain. The moment passed like a verdict, unspoken but felt. Still, Jasmine sat tall. She didn't rush to defend herself. She didn't fall into the trap, because she knew if she responded too fast, too emotionally, they'd say she was overreacting. So she waited. And in that moment, her silence said more than any speech could. "I see what you're doing, and I won't let you control this moment." The air was thick with tension, Booker's words still hanging in the room, but Jasmine Crockett's silence was louder than anything he could say. Booker, caught in the fervor of his own rhetoric, had unleashed a barrage of accusations. His voice filled the space with the sharp edges of insinuation and implication, each sentence carefully constructed to undermine Jasmine's character. He had no need to prove her guilt. He was relying on the power of suggestion, painting her as a partisan, a player in a larger, nefarious game. His words dripped with confidence, even as they spiraled into an increasingly personal attack. The Democratic side of the room seemed to nod in approval, their subtle expressions of agreement punctuating his every word. The spotlight was on Booker, his momentum unstoppable. The room was with him. And Jasmine? Jasmine didn't move. Her eyes never left Booker, but she was calm, eerily calm. The contrast was jarring. Where Booker's energy surged, hers was still, a rock in the middle of a storm. She didn't respond to his accusations, didn't show the faintest sign of cracking under pressure. It wasn't indifference, it was discipline. She had been through this before, and yet every second of silence, every second that passed without her speaking, was more unnerving than anything Booker could say. And then, without warning, her hand began to move. A slow, deliberate gesture, like the quiet pulling of a trigger. She reached for her leather folder. The sound of the folder opening was barely perceptible in the midst of Booker's voice. But that was the moment. Everyone felt it. A shift. A pause in the tension. Booker's words, though still rolling off his tongue, suddenly seemed distant. The intensity in the room, which had been building around Booker, now started to coalesce around her. The focus for just a heartbeat was on Jasmine, not because she had spoken, but because she hadn't. She lifted her water glass with a delicate precision, setting it down with a soft, deliberate click, like the ticking of a clock in a room suddenly too quiet. As Booker continued his onslaught, his words becoming more fervent, Jasmine glanced at him, not in anger, but with the kind of look that felt like it could strip away every piece of armor he had built around his argument. It wasn't a glare, but it was filled with a calmness so intense it almost felt like a challenge. She wasn't rattled. She wasn't defensive. She was waiting. And as the camera caught the briefest flicker of that gaze, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. The air was electric, charged with the expectation that something profound, was about to happen. For a brief moment, it felt like everything stopped. Booker, too caught up in his own rhythm, hadn't realized it yet, but the audience, the people watching, felt it. This wasn't a retreat. This wasn't surrender. Jasmine Crockett was biding her time, and the silence between them spoke louder than any words Booker had thrown her way. That quiet power, that unshakable poise, it made him seem small. It made his rhetoric seem hollow. The stage had shifted. Jasmine wasn't just a witness anymore. She had become the force that would decide the course of this hearing. And still the silence stretched. The room, the cameras, the viewers, they all knew something was about to break. What would she do next? Would she crush his narrative with evidence? Or would this silence, this powerful, purposeful silence, do the talking for her? The tension in the room, thick and suffocating, had reached a breaking point. But Jasmine Crockett's silence, so carefully maintained, was about to snap the razor-thin thread that held the room together. Booker's words had echoed through the space, like a drum beat, growing louder and more intense with each passing second. His accusations, thinly veiled as questions, had set the stage for what seemed like a public dissection of her character. The audience, the cameras, the aides in the room were all locked in on him, eagerly awaiting the final nail in Jasmine's political coffin. He had come with one goal: to reduce her to a partisan voice, to discredit her before she ever had a chance to speak. He had his moment, he had landed his blows. But what he hadn't anticipated was the quiet strength of the woman sitting across from him. And then, just as the room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation, Jasmine broke her silence, but not in the way anyone expected. She didn't respond with anger, with raised fists or accusations of her own. No, her words were measured, deliberate, calm, almost too calm. There was no fire in her voice, but the coolness of her question struck harder than any emotional retort could have. "Senator Booker," she began, her voice unwavering, "are you familiar with a donation made to your senatorial campaign on March 12th, 2019, in the amount of $10,000? The words seemed to hang in the air for a beat too long. For a brief second, the room fell into a stunned silence, as though the question itself had an immense weight attached to it. Jasmine didn't look down at her notes, didn't shift in her seat. She simply asked, calmly, without hesitation, like she had all the time in the world. The question wasn't shouted, wasn't rushed. It was a carefully placed bomb, its fuse burning with quiet intensity. And with it, Jasmine shifted the entire room's focus. All eyes turned to Booker as the unspoken accusation of conflict of interest began to swirl in the air. Booker, who had been riding the momentum of his assault, faltered. It was a small moment, but in it, everything changed. The confidence he had worn so easily began to crack. Just slightly at first, then a little more. He fumbled for words. I, I have many donors, Miss Crockett, he said, his voice losing its earlier conviction. He seemed to be grasping for something solid to hold on to, but nothing he said could undo the sudden discomfort in his posture. I follow all proper disclosure procedures, he added, almost as though he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else in the room. The audience, the staffers, the cameras, they were all watching, waiting for the next move. Jasmine's question had shifted the atmosphere in the room from one of aggressive certainty to doubt. Booker, for the first time, was not the one leading the charge. He was on the defensive, his carefully constructed narrative of righteousness and transparency now unraveling in real time. Jasmine's composure, her stillness, was in stark contrast to the growing unease in Booker's body language. She didn't need to shout or accuse. The question alone, quiet, pointed, was enough. Booker's hesitation, the faint crack in his previously impenetrable confidence, spoke volumes. He didn't know how to answer her question. The transparency he had built around himself was now under scrutiny, and in that silence, in the absence of Booker's typical fiery rhetoric, Jasmine had shifted the power dynamic entirely. What had started as an all-out attack against her was now an investigation into his own actions, and no one in the room had missed the change. In that crucial moment, the hearing room shifted as Jasmine Crockett, once the target of the attack, became the one holding the reins of power. The calculated silence following her question about the donation was broken only by the rustle of paper as Jasmine moved into the next phase of her strategy. There was no rush, no sense of urgency in her movements, just the controlled precision of someone who had long known what needed to be done. She didn't need to raise her voice, didn't need to fill the room with emotional outbursts. Jasmine's quiet confidence was more powerful than any grand speech could be. She had waited for this moment, and now it was her turn to speak the truth. Her hand slid into the leather folder once more, pulling out 3 neatly organized documents, each one carefully placed in front of her like the pieces of a puzzle that, when assembled, would expose the man sitting across from her. She began with the first document, laying it out for all to see. A $15,000 donation from a tech company with a long history of opposing regulations that could harm its profits. Then, without skipping a beat, she turned to the second. A $7,000 contribution from a real estate mogul whose development projects had been at the center of zoning and tax disputes, projects that had mysteriously been approved shortly after the donation. The third donation was perhaps the most damning, a $12,000 transfer from a pharmaceutical lobbying group just weeks before Booker had sponsored legislation that benefited the industry. With each figure, Jasmine's words remained cool, unfazed. She did not flinch. She did not raise her voice to dramatize the point. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves, but what made the evidence even more striking was the timing. She slid a new set of documents across the table, email chains that showed Booker's aides discussing strategic donations to help advance their legislative agenda, followed by a series of memos linking those donations directly to decisions Booker had made on the Senate floor. Jasmine's delivery was methodical, as if this were not a revelation but a well-worn process. She was not surprised by the information. She had expected it, and now it was being laid bare for everyone in the room. Jasmine didn't need to say much. The documents themselves were enough. She handed the papers over to the committee clerk, who started distributing them. One by one, the senators flipped through the pages. Some squinted at the figures, others read through the emails, and all of them, without exception, knew what this meant. This wasn't just about policy anymore. This wasn't just a hearing about electoral integrity. This was about accountability, about a powerful senator whose public stance of righteousness now stood in direct contradiction to the private dealings exposed by these documents. The room was completely still. The murmurs that had once circulated about her character now seemed distant, irrelevant. Booker, once so assured in his attacks, had lost his composure. His earlier confidence had faded into a subtle unease, his eyes darting between the papers and the committee members. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. His previous attempts to paint her as unfit, untrustworthy, began to feel increasingly hollow, like a house of cards on the verge of collapsing. He stuttered. His words failed him. The silence in the room was deafening. Everyone, even those who had initially sided with him, now questioned his integrity. Jasmine remained silent, but her silence was a statement in itself. She had asked her question. She had laid out the evidence. She had shifted the narrative. The power dynamic had completely reversed. In a room full of critics and rivals, it was now Jasmine who commanded attention, and Booker who was left fumbling to defend himself. The committee, once so ready to pick apart her every move, was now hesitant, uncertain. No one spoke. No one needed to. The truth had been presented, and for the first time that day, Jasmine was not the one on trial. She had become the one asking the questions. And in doing so, she had flipped the entire course of the hearing. The room hung in a suffocating silence, each moment stretching longer as Booker floundered, trying to regain the upper hand he had lost in the blink of an eye. The smooth cadence of his earlier speech, filled with sharp jabs and confident rhetoric, was nowhere to be found. Now there was a sharpness to his voice that was laced with uncertainty, like a man who had stepped too far, only to realize he had nowhere to stand. His face reddened, and his usual commanding presence faltered as he searched for words that would allow him to regain control. His earlier attack on Jasmine, so cleanly executed, now felt like an echo, distant and ineffective. The truth, the weight of the evidence she had just laid out, hung heavy in the room, suffocating the air. Jasmine's composed silence, so deliberate and poised, had torn apart the very foundation of his attack. Booker's attempt at recovery was weak. "This is a distraction," he blurted out, his words cracking as they left his mouth. His attempt at deflection sounded hollow, an empty defense that betrayed the panic rising beneath his calm exterior. The phrase came out too quickly, too desperately. It was a feeble grasp at a lifeline that wasn't there, and everyone in the room felt it. That one sentence, the awkward, strained plea, echoed far louder than any of his previous arguments. And as the cameras caught his moment of vulnerability, the words, "This is a distraction," became his undoing. The line, once spoken with misplaced confidence, would soon be twisted into something entirely different by the very medium that had once supported him. The clip, caught in real time, would spread like wildfire on the internet. It wasn't just a blunder. It was a moment that would haunt him for days, weeks, maybe longer. In the silence that followed, Jasmine did not react. She did not flinch. She did not look surprised by his stumble. She had anticipated this moment of weakness, and with the poise that had defined her throughout the hearing, she seized it. Her voice when it came was steady, too steady to be ignored. "I'm simply applying the same standard you set for me," she said, her words laced with quiet authority. There was no harshness, no spite, just the calm strength of someone who had been unjustly accused and was now finally allowed to speak the truth. She was not attacking him. She was reminding everyone in the room that the double standard they had allowed was now exposed. She had been subjected to intense scrutiny, accused of bias without evidence, and yet, when the tables were turned, Booker was the one who was unprepared, the one who had to resort to deflection. Her words struck a deeper chord than anyone in the room could have predicted. She wasn't just responding to Booker. She was addressing the very premise of the hearing itself. The very idea that her integrity could be questioned based on assumptions about her political leanings had been challenged, and now Booker stood exposed for the same behavior. Jasmine had not raised her voice. She had not made a scene. She had simply stated a fact. If Booker demanded a level of scrutiny for her, he should expect the same for himself. It wasn't an attack. It was a correction. And as the room processed the weight of her statement, the truth hung like a heavy fog. Booker, once the figurehead of moral outrage in the room, now found himself on the defensive. He had been so sure of his righteousness, so confident in his ability to control the narrative. But now the narrative had shifted. Jasmine's calm, composed response had turned the tide. Booker's words, once the weapon, were now the exposed weakness. The room that had once been filled with support for him now felt heavy with the shift in dynamics. The predator had become the prey, and the silent force of Jasmine's counterattack was undeniable. The room felt heavier than before, as though the weight of the words that had been spoken could no longer be ignored. The battle had shifted, and Booker was no longer the one controlling the narrative. Jasmine Crockett had just taken the reins. As Booker struggled to find his footing, unable to recover the momentum he once had, Jasmine felt the space open up before her. It wasn't about defending herself anymore. This moment was about clarity, about exposing the truth with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. She had been asked to justify her integrity, to prove that her every action and every decision had been transparent. But now it was Booker who needed to answer for the same scrutiny. Her voice cut through the tension in the room, calm but with an undeniable power that echoed in every corner. "Senator Booker, let's talk about transparency," she said, her words slow but steady. "Every single donation I've received, every dollar contributed to my campaign, has been publicly disclosed. There's no secret here. There's nothing hidden. My supporters, my backers, they are known to the public. There's nothing to question." She let the silence follow her statement, the weight of it sinking in. This was the truth. No corners were being cut, no backdoors involved. Jasmine Crockett had nothing to hide. She paused, watching Booker's eyes shift ever so slightly, the unease creeping in. It was subtle, but it was there. He was waiting for her to say more, but Jasmine wasn't done. This wasn't just about defending herself. This was about dismantling Booker's narrative. "Now let's discuss your situation," she continued, her tone unwavering. "I have never once sent a letter to a government department asking for favorable treatment after receiving a donation. Not once." She let her words linger, watching him as the truth of her statement began to take root. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. She spoke with quiet authority, a confidence that only comes when you know you are right. And then she landed the final blow. "But you, Senator Booker," she said, leaning forward slightly, "you've done just that. You received donations from organizations that have a direct financial interest in changes to federal policy. And after those donations, you wrote letters to the Treasury Department, pushing for changes in investigations that could benefit those same organizations." Her eyes never left his, and she didn't wait for his response. The room was already reacting, shifting in real time, feeling the weight of her words as they settled into the space between them. The silence that followed was profound. Booker's face tightened. He couldn't brush it off. There was no quick comeback, no offhand remark to dismiss it. The room could feel it. The moral high ground he had built so carefully had just crumbled in front of their eyes. The camera lingered on his face, capturing every moment of his discomfort. His mouth opened, but no words came. Jasmine had not attacked him. She had simply laid the facts before him, without fury, without aggression, and now he was forced to sit in them, unable to escape. Jasmine Crockett had drawn a line in the sand. She had shown the room and the world that the standards Booker had set for her were not universal. He too had made decisions based on donations, based on personal interests hidden behind a facade of moral outrage. And now the truth was clear. Jasmine's actions were out in the open, for all to see, while Booker had spent years cultivating an image of integrity, only to have it shattered in seconds. The stark contrast between the two of them could not have been more evident. She had lived her truth openly. He had built his career on a lie of moral superiority that was now exposed for what it truly was. The room was silent, and in that silence the truth was louder than anything that had been spoken before. The atmosphere in the room had become almost suffocating, the air thick with the echoes of Jasmine's calm but powerful revelations. Booker's earlier confidence, once towering over the room like a fortress, had crumbled in the face of truth. And now, with a single command, Chairman Durbin had brought the session to a halt. The sound of the gavel falling was like the final note of a symphony that had reached its crescendo. "We'll take a brief recess," Durbin's voice rang out, but the tension in the room was palpable. The recess was more than just a break. It was a moment of reckoning, a chance for the room to process what had just transpired. The committee members rose to their feet, their movements sluggish as though they too were trapped in the weight of the sudden shift in power. Booker, who had been so sure of his dominance, seemed to shrink under the gravity of what had just happened. His words, once delivered with the authority of someone in control, now echoed hollow in the ears of everyone present. As Booker turned and walked briskly toward the door, His face was a study in frustration and disbelief. His usual confident stride was replaced with hurried steps, as though he were trying to outrun the consequences of his own actions. He glanced back only once, his eyes momentarily meeting Jasmine's. But there was no defiance in that look, only the quiet understanding that he had been outmaneuvered. He muttered something to his assistant, his words swallowed by the murmur of the room, but his body language said it all. He was rattled. The facade he had carefully constructed over years of public service was now cracking, and he had no idea how to put the pieces back together. On the other hand, Jasmine Crockett remained seated at the table, her posture as unyielding as ever. She had not moved. She had not reacted. She had not allowed the chaos surrounding her to disturb the calm that had become her shield. As Booker rushed out, his mind undoubtedly racing to find a way to salvage his position, Jasmine simply sipped from her glass of water. The contrast between them couldn't have been more striking. She, the accused, was unshaken. He, the accuser, had been reduced to a man on the defensive, unsure of how to move forward. The power dynamic that had once favored Booker was now firmly in Jasmine's hands, but she wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. She had won, but her victory was quiet. It was measured. It was the kind of victory that came not from emotion, but from unwavering confidence in the truth. The room, once filled with murmurs of support for Booker, was now holding its collective breath. Jasmine's calmness in the face of everything thrown at her had unsettled the room in a way Booker's passionate speech had never been able to. She had not been broken by the injustice she had faced. She had not been shaken by the personal attacks. Instead, she had turned the tables with the quietest of gestures, the reveal of undeniable facts, the revelation of hypocrisy, and the mastery of self-control. While Booker had sought to make her the target, Jasmine had made him the subject of scrutiny, and in doing so, had shifted the entire balance of power. As Booker exited the room, his every movement was infused with the weight of his defeat. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud, but the echoes of his departure lingered, a symbol of his lost control. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained. The quiet strength she had exuded was now even more apparent. She had not raised her voice. She had not shouted him down. But she had done something more significant. She had exposed him, not through words but through truth. And in that quiet, deliberate stillness, she had secured her position, not just in the room, but in the hearts and minds of everyone who had witnessed this pivotal moment. The silence spoke volumes. Booker was defeated. Jasmine had emerged victorious. And with that, the power dynamics had been forever altered. The moment the recess ended, it was clear the dynamic in the room had shifted irrevocably. Booker walked back in, but his presence was no longer commanding. It was reluctant, hesitant, as though he were walking back into a situation he no longer controlled. The sounds of chairs scraping against the floor seemed to amplify in the silence that followed his return. It wasn't just the physical noise. It was the emotional weight, the sense that Booker had lost the upper hand. He stepped back into the hearing room with a strained composure, but it was clear to everyone that the storm he had stormed in with had long passed. The confidence that had once radiated from him had crumbled under the weight of Jasmine's calm and precise response. Booker sat back down at his table, adjusting his papers without looking at anyone. The same fire that had fueled his earlier speeches now seemed distant, reduced to nothing more than a flicker in his tired eyes. He opened his mouth to speak but hesitated, as though his usual words no longer felt right. Finally, after a brief pause, he offered something so mundane, so technical, that it felt almost absurd. "Could you clarify the dates of these donations in the documents you've presented?" he asked, his voice hollow, almost detached. It was a far cry from the fiery rhetoric he had unleashed just moments ago, trying to paint Jasmine as untrustworthy, unqualified, and politically biased. The room felt smaller somehow, more oppressive. His question, so devoid of substance, lingered in the air like an afterthought. The Democratic side, which had once rallied behind his passionate accusations, now sat motionless. No one spoke, not a word of support, not a murmur of approval. They were all silent, their heads slightly lowered, as though they were unwilling to meet his gaze. They were no longer the cheerleaders to his narrative, but silent observers, unwilling to defend the man who had so confidently attacked an opponent and had now been reduced to a man scraping for any semblance of control. The contrast was staggering. Before, Booker had dominated the room, his every word met with nods and agreement from his colleagues. Now, even those who had once backed him seemed unwilling to even look at him. The silence wasn't just from his adversaries, it was from everyone. The Democratic side, once quick to back him, now felt distant, as though the words he had spoken had soured the atmosphere. They knew what had happened. They knew what had shifted in the course of the hearing. Jasmine Crockett had turned the tables, and Booker's once unshakable confidence had been reduced to an echo of its former self. Booker's eyes flitted across the room, never fully meeting anyone's gaze. His once steady posture had slumped ever so slightly, a small but significant shift that told the story of his mental and emotional decline. The camera zoomed in on his face, capturing the slight tension in his jaw, the furrow of his brow, the way his eyes darted nervously, unwilling to settle on one person for too long. There was no more fire in his gaze, no more certainty. His earlier conviction, the righteousness he had worn so proudly, had been stripped away by the weight of his own failure. His eyes, which had once been full of fire, were now full of something else. Doubt, discomfort, and perhaps for the first time in a long while, the realization that he had underestimated his opponent. Jasmine, on the other hand, remained steadfast, her posture unchanged, her face calm and unreadable. She had delivered her facts, and in doing so, had not only exposed the cracks in Booker's armor, but had forced him to confront his own hypocrisy. The room could feel the shift in energy. The Democratic side was no longer rallying behind Booker. Instead, they were watching him closely, their silence a quiet acknowledgement that they knew the truth had shifted. As Booker continued to fumble for his words, a deep sense of isolation seemed to descend upon him. He was no longer a leader in this room. He was a man whose narrative had collapsed under the weight of the evidence Jasmine had presented. His usual ability to command the room, to assert moral superiority, had been replaced by a hollow, desperate attempt to hold on to whatever dignity he could muster. But it was too late. The moment had passed. Jasmine had made sure of that. The camera zoomed in on Booker's face again, capturing the subtle but unmistakable shift in his expression. His eyes were no longer filled with conviction. Instead, they seemed tired, distant. His once bright gaze had dulled, replaced by something more vulnerable, something that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the man with the moral high ground. He was the man caught in a lie, trying to find a way out of it without drawing more attention to himself. It was a look that seemed almost pitiful, but it was more than that. It was a realization that in a single moment, he had been undone. The committee members who had been watching intently, some with eyes wide, others with furrowed brows, now exchanged glances. The power had shifted. It was no longer about the accusations Booker had leveled at Jasmine. It was about the undeniable truth that Jasmine had revealed. In her calm, unflinching defense, she had exposed the fragility of Booker's position, and no amount of technical questions or reassertions of his moral superiority could undo the damage she had done. Jasmine Crockett had taken control of the narrative, and Booker, once the self-assured prosecutor, had been reduced to nothing more than a man trying to regain some semblance of authority in a room that had already moved on. The hearing had ended, but the real fallout was just beginning. The moment Jasmine had turned the tables, exposing Booker's hypocrisy with chilling precision, rippled across every screen and every social media feed. As soon as the session concluded and cameras were packed away, the courtroom's energy didn't die down. It surged. Within minutes, a clip of Jasmine's devastating rebuttal was being shared across Twitter, Facebook, and every news outlet that could capture it. Her calm, controlled response to Booker's floundering attack had turned her from an underdog to a hero in the eyes of many. She had done what few others could do. She had taken the fight directly to Booker's doorstep and laid him bare for the world to see. The clip, which showed her methodically exposing Booker's own vulnerabilities, quickly went viral, capturing the imagination of millions. In just a few short hours, it was everywhere. Pushed out in endless retweets, reshared by commentators, and picked up by newsrooms desperate to capitalize on the drama. But it wasn't just the content of the video that caused a stir. It was the sheer, undeniable power of what Jasmine had achieved. Her silence had been deafening. Her words had been surgical. She had outwitted a seasoned politician in real time, and that's what people were talking about. Media outlets across the political spectrum buzzed with reactions. On the right, conservative voices hailed Jasmine as a hero, someone who had exposed the deep-seated double standards and hypocrisy of the left. They praised her for remaining calm under fire, for turning the tables without so much as raising her voice. To them, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the political establishment, an outsider who had come in, not with force, but with the unassailable power of truth. But on the left, the reaction was less certain. Liberal commentators, who had once celebrated Booker as a beacon of progressive values, now struggled to defend him. The clip was being replayed endlessly across their social media platforms, and the looks of discomfort on Booker's face were undeniable. They had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. Their champion had been exposed, and the moral high ground he had once claimed was now a distant memory. Yet even as some cautiously praised Jasmine's composure, others shifted uncomfortably. How could they spin this? How could they defend the man who had so publicly faltered? The media chaos that followed was something few had expected. Jasmine Crockett's response had done more than just silence her accuser. It had become the subject of an entire political debate. It wasn't just about who was right in the hearing anymore. It was about the larger narrative of who controlled the truth and how the media would process it. In the conservative press, her calm demeanor was painted as a masterclass in political combat. A number of prominent figures, from right-wing pundits to former politicians, lauded her for her ability to dismantle Booker's entire platform with little more than a few pointed questions. They celebrated her as the voice of reason in a world dominated by spectacle and emotion. "Jasmine Crockett shows how it's done," was a phrase that quickly became a rallying cry in the conservative sphere. Her steady, controlled response was the antidote to the outraged politics that had become all too common, and they weren't shy about spreading the message. On the other side of the political spectrum, however, the media landscape was far more divided. Liberal outlets that had once revered Booker's impassioned speeches and righteous indignation now faced the uncomfortable reality that they couldn't escape what had happened in the hearing. His frantic defensive response, contrasted with Jasmine's cool, calculated dissection, painted a stark picture of who had truly won the exchange. Some left-leaning commentators tried to soften the blow by deflecting the conversation back to the substance of the hearing, focusing on the policy issues, downplaying the personal revelations. But even they couldn't escape the underlying message. Booker had been thoroughly outclassed, not by a rhetorical juggernaut, but by someone who had shown him up through the sheer power of measured silence and impeccable timing. The viral nature of the clip didn't just stay within the confines of media elites and political commentators. Jasmine's victory had become a pop culture sensation. Memes of Booker's stunned face and Jasmine's calm response flooded the internet, shared and reshared by people from every walk of life. It was more than just a political victory. It was a moment that transcended party lines, touching something deeper about how we view strength, composure, and accountability in the political arena. The video was everywhere, from Twitter feeds to late-night shows, where it became a punchline in discussions about political confrontation. But beyond the viral nature of the clip and the media frenzy it sparked, what truly resonated with the public was the sense of injustice that had been so elegantly called out by Jasmine. She wasn't just defending herself, she was calling out a system that had allowed hypocrisy to go unchecked. The injustice wasn't just in what Booker had said, it was in how the political elite had been allowed to escape scrutiny for so long, only for Jasmine to pull back the curtain with a calm and undeniable precision. The public had watched her, not as a victim, but as someone who stood firm in the face of an attack that many would have crumbled under. And in doing so, she had turned the tables not only on Booker, but on the entire political establishment that had underestimated her. Jasmine Crockett's name was now cemented in the annals of political theater, not as someone who fought fire with fire, but as someone who used the quiet, unyielding power of truth to dismantle a well-crafted narrative. And the world was watching, The aftermath of the hearing unfolded like a thunderclap in a storm, the reverberations shaking the political landscape in ways that no one could have predicted. Booker, once the shining star of the Senate floor, found himself slowly fading into the background. The immediate effect was undeniable. Just days after the hearing, Booker's presence in the media began to shrink. Where he had once been invited to high-profile talk shows and news segments, now his phone remained silent. Public appearances, once a staple of his calendar, were being rescheduled or quietly canceled. The media that had once hung on his every word now seemed hesitant to engage. His moral authority had been shattered, and without it, his carefully cultivated public persona began to erode. His legislative proposals, particularly those he had championed in the wake of the hearing, were suddenly sidelined. The bills he had pushed so hard for, once seen as progressive wins, now found themselves gathering dust on the back burner. His calls for reform, once loudly applauded, were met with muted responses. Even his own party, which had once rallied behind him, now seemed reluctant to give him the same support. The very foundation he had built for himself was crumbling, piece by piece, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. But Jasmine's trajectory, on the other hand, was climbing. The moment the hearing concluded, her name began to resonate beyond the confines of the room. The media that had once been skeptical, that had reduced her to a side character in Booker's narrative, now found themselves clamoring to hear more from her. Invitations flooded in, not just from mainstream outlets, but from respected think tanks and legal organizations eager to hear her insights. Conservative think tanks, often known for their ideological opposition to progressive ideals, reached out to her with the kind of respect they had never offered before. They saw in her the clarity, the calm, and the integrity that could make her a powerful voice in shaping policy debates moving forward. Her reputation as a political force, someone who could take down powerful opponents with nothing but the truth, was cemented. In the days following the hearing, Jasmine was invited to testify as a witness in several upcoming hearings, her name now being placed alongside seasoned professionals and legal experts. For someone who had entered the political stage as an underdog, this was a monumental leap forward. She wasn't just invited to speak, she was now in demand, sought after by lawmakers and think tanks alike for her expertise. Her calm, calculated responses had given her credibility. A credibility that, in a world of sensationalized rhetoric and political theater, was more valuable than gold. Jasmine had done what many had thought impossible. She had turned the political tide with integrity and precision, outshining her most formidable critics. The contrast in their post-hearing trajectories could not have been more stark. Booker, once on the rise, had now seen his influence wane in the span of a few days. Jasmine, who had fought to be seen, had found herself elevated to new heights, not through loud declarations or emotional outbursts, but through the quiet force of truth. Booker had spent years crafting an image of moral superiority, but in one hearing, Jasmine had dismantled that image with the simplicity of facts and reason. Where Booker had once been the voice of the party, now it was Jasmine's calm, unflinching voice that resonated with the public. The contrast wasn't just in their careers, it was in the narrative of power itself. Booker had used his position to launch accusations, to tear down his opponents with fiery speeches and emotional attacks. But Jasmine, who had been the target of those same tactics, had responded with grace and facts. She had not risen through the ranks by outshouting others. She had risen by standing firm in the face of injustice, by demanding fairness even when the system was set against her. And now that strength was being recognized. It was a quiet revolution, a revolution built on the idea that integrity, truth, and composure were just as powerful as any bombastic speech or grandstanding display. As Booker's visibility continued to shrink, Jasmine's presence in political circles only grew. She was becoming a sought-after voice in the corridors of power. Her calmness under pressure had become her trademark. In a world where drama often took center stage, Jasmine had proved that composure and intellect could capture the public's attention just as effectively. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who could take on the establishment and come out victorious, not through force or intimidation, but through the sheer power of being right. In the weeks that followed, Booker's decline was visible in the press. Every mention of his name was now followed by reminders of the disastrous hearing, the moment when he had faltered in front of the cameras. The narrative that had once been about his progressive fight for justice had become about his loss of moral authority. Meanwhile, Jasmine continued to rise, speaking with clarity and purpose, engaging in the debates that mattered. The contrast was undeniable. The once rising star had been eclipsed, and the woman who had been dismissed as just another challenger had claimed her place at the table. In the world of politics, where narratives were everything, Jasmine Crockett had rewritten her own story, and in doing so, had shifted the balance of power. The reverberations of the hearing stretched far beyond the walls of the Senate. What had transpired in that room, once a battleground between two opposing political figures, had now become something more. A moment that would define careers and reshape narratives in ways no one had anticipated. Jasmine Crockett's calm yet decisive response to Booker's attack had not only altered the course of the hearing, it had altered the very nature of how power and truth were viewed in the public eye. It was a victory, yes, but it was also a powerful reminder of the value of composure, integrity, and the quiet strength of standing firm in the face of adversity. The political establishment had underestimated Jasmine, just as they had underestimated countless others who had fought for fairness and truth in a world that often ignored both. But her victory, so deftly achieved, was a lesson that would transcend the confines of Capitol Hill. A few months later, at a prestigious university, a political science professor stood before a group of eager students. As he lectured, he pulled up a slide on the screen. A moment that changed political trajectories. It was the clip. Jasmine Crockett, calm as the storm raged around her, methodically dismantling Booker's accusations, with nothing more than facts, poise, and patience. The professor, an expert in political strategy, paused for effect before continuing. This moment, while small in the grand scope of history, marked a turning point in political engagement. It was not about who shouted the loudest, who held the most influence, or who had the largest audience. It was about one woman who, despite being outnumbered, outmaneuvered her opponent not with force, but with integrity. The students watched, captivated, as the professor dissected the sequence of events, showing how the power dynamics had shifted. How Booker, once seen as a political giant, had been brought to his knees by the quiet force of truth. He explained how Jasmine's response became not just a defining moment in her career, but a pivotal lesson for those who came after her. It was a lesson about the often overlooked power of remaining composed, of standing up for truth in a system that so often rewards spectacle over substance. As the lecture continued, the professor highlighted how Jasmine's actions had struck a nerve in the political world. Her calm, her ability to stay focused and grounded, had defied every expectation placed upon her. In a political landscape where the loudest voices often dominate, where media cycles are driven by outrage and conflict, Jasmine's moment reminded everyone in the room of something fundamental. That quiet strength, clarity, and unwavering commitment to the truth can be just as, if not more, powerful than any rhetoric. The students, many of whom had come to study politics with the belief that it was a world governed by noise, aggression, and spectacle, now saw a new path laid before them. They saw that real change often comes not from battling the system with more noise, but from having the courage to stay true to one's principles, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The professor made it clear, Jasmine had not only won a political battle, she had changed the framework of how battles in politics would be fought from now on. It wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a cultural one. Her response became a touchstone, a model for anyone looking to challenge the status quo without resorting to the same tactics of division, anger, and fear. The lesson went deeper than politics. It was about the power of personal integrity, the courage to stand alone, and the belief that truth could be a weapon far more potent than any slander or attack. The impact of that hearing stretched beyond Capitol Hill, making its way into textbooks, academic journals, and political discourse across the nation. The story of Jasmine Crockett and Cory Booker was no longer just about two figures battling over policy. It was about the larger fight for integrity in an era where integrity often seems to have little place. And as the professor closed the lecture, he left his students with a final thought. In the end, power is not about who shouts the loudest. It's about who holds the line when the world expects them to break. And in that room, as Booker's character was torn down and Jasmine's was elevated, that lesson had been made clear for all who were paying attention. In a world where political battles are often fought in the spotlight, where loud voices and sensational headlines are prized above substance, one lesson had become abundantly clear. The calm, the prepared, and those who know exactly when to strike will always come out on top. Jasmine Crockett had been thrust into the center of a political firestorm, an arena where every word was scrutinized, every gesture magnified, and every move taken to be a sign of weakness or strength. Yet what she had done in that Senate hearing, in front of millions of viewers, was nothing short of remarkable. She didn't fall for the theatrics, the grandstanding, or the high-pitched emotional outbursts that often dominate political discourse. Instead, she used her greatest asset, silence. And in that silence, she displayed the kind of composure and strategic thinking that would be the model for future political confrontations. As the hearings wore on, the world watched as Booker, once seen as a towering figure, unraveled before their eyes. His earlier confidence, built on years of impassioned speeches and political capital, began to dissipate as Jasmine remained calm under fire. Each time he tried to strike, she countered with a precision that left him scrambling for words, his arguments falling apart in the face of her unwavering logic. She had prepared for this moment, not by crafting a grandiose speech or rehearsing fiery rebuttals, but by knowing exactly what needed to be said, and more importantly, when to say it. Booker, for all his grand rhetoric, had been the one who could not maintain control. His emotional intensity, while it had served him in other moments, had now become his downfall. It was as if the more he pushed, the more he revealed his own weaknesses. The more he tried to dominate the conversation, the more he exposed his own hypocrisy. Meanwhile, Jasmine's calm, collected responses, backed by hard evidence and reason, made her the quiet force in the room. In an era where louder voices often won out, Jasmine's poise, her strategic thinking, and her ability to pick her moments were the weapons that defeated the overwhelming force of spectacle and noise. This was the true power dynamic at play in today's politics. The spectacle of outrage, the play for emotional dominance may win short-term battles, but it is the ones who are prepared, who can handle the heat and take their time before striking with precision, who will claim victory in the long run. Jasmine's calculated responses, her ability to remain composed under pressure, were not the reactions of someone who was playing catch-up. They were the moves of someone who had already figured out the game. She wasn't just participating in this hearing, she was mastering it. And the lesson for everyone watching was clear. In the age of performance politics, those who understand the value of silence, preparation, and timing will always hold the upper hand. For Jasmine, the attack was personal. She had been targeted, her character assassinated in front of a room full of political power players and millions of viewers. She had faced the full brunt of a political opponent who believed that sheer force of will and emotion could carry him to victory. And yet she had endured, remaining calm, even when her opponent tried to tear her down. This wasn't just a battle over policy. It was a battle over character, integrity, and the very principles of fair play. Jasmine had been asked to prove herself in a system designed to crush her. She had been questioned, insulted, and doubted. Yet in the end, it was her ability to stay composed, her unshakable commitment to truth, and her understanding of the right time to make her move that gave her the ultimate advantage. As the media swarmed to cover the aftermath of the hearing, the narrative began to shift. Booker's emotional outbursts were dissected, the cracks in his moral high ground exposed. Meanwhile, Jasmine's steady, calculated responses became the gold standard for political discourse. The contrast was stark. Booker had fought to be seen as the moral champion, but it was Jasmine who had emerged as the true leader. The world was watching, and it had seen exactly what had happened. The loud, brash tactics of spectacle had been outmaneuvered by the quiet, powerful force of someone who was simply better prepared. The lesson was universal. In the high-stakes arena of politics, those who thrive are not necessarily the ones who shout the loudest, but those who are the most strategic, the most prepared, and the ones who know how to play the long game. This was the type of leadership the world needed, not driven by emotion or outbursts, but grounded in principle, truth, and the ability to seize the right moment. Jasmine had proven that the game was not only about winning battles, but about controlling the narrative, understanding when to strike, and knowing when silence was the most powerful weapon. In the end, it was her unwavering ability to stay true to herself, to the facts, and to the bigger picture that ensured she would be the one to rise above the noise and claim the high ground. In an age where the loudest voices often drown out reason, Jasmine Crockett had shown the world that true power lies in those who know how to rise above the fray. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.